In this video, I'm going to be walking through the React Router tutorial where we create a little address book where we can record contacts, delete them, edit them, add notes, all sorts of stuff. This really shows the core feature set of React Router when you use it as a framework. So to get started, we're going to copy this little command that's going to generate the template for us that we're going to be using throughout this tutorial. So open up my terminal and I'll just type that in. It's going to ask us a couple questions like, what do we want to name the project? And do we want the Git repository? And do we want to install the dependencies? Now that that's done, we can run npm run dev, and we'll see on localhost 5173, we've got a very, very basic app with pretty much nothing. We can click on these contacts and we actually get 404s because really nothing's hooked up. So let's go ahead and start building out this application. First thing we want to do is look at the files that we already have. So inside of this app directory, we have a root.tsx file. This file is pretty important. It's actually the root of the entire application. So every single route that we have inside our entire application is going to be rendering with this root. So this root is going to apply to every single route in our application. It is the root of the entire app, and so everything flows from here. It sets up things like a layout, which is our HTML and our head and the body. It also has an error boundary, which we're not really going to discuss much, but if you want to read more about that, we have some documentation that's linked to inside the template. This error boundary is here for whenever we throw an error or if things go wrong, we want to show the user something useful. And then we have the default export, which we'll be talking about these a lot because every single route module will need a default export. And so inside the root, we have this very simple one that is rendering this sidebar. So this is what we have on the left-hand side. All right, let's create our first route. So inside the app, I'm just going to make a new directory called routes. We could call this whatever we want, but routes is a good name. And we'll create a file called contact.tsx. Again, this could be called whatever we want. And for this to actually be usable, we have to use yet another file. And for a React Router to actually pick up that this is going to be a route module, inside of routes.ts, we need to set it up as a route module. So we're going to import from @React router /dev/ routes. And we're going to import route. So here we can start defining our different routes. So the first argument that we give is we actually give the path. In this case, we're going to do contacts, and then we'll do contact ID with a little colon here. This colon means that it's going to actually match contact / whatever we want, basically. So if we're in here and we do contacts /1 or 2 or 3 or whatever, it is going to match that. And then we can use that value, that whatever right there, as what we typically call a route param. And so that route param will become a sort of data that we can use. In this case, it's going to be called contact ID. The next thing that we pass into route is the file path for the route module itself. So it's automatically going to be looking for app. We can change that if we want to, but we're not going to. It's a nice default. So we'll say route /contact.tsx. So inside of contact.tsx, we can export a default function. Doesn't matter what it's called, we'll call it contact, and sure, that's fine. We can return a div with contact. So now if we go to these pages, well, nothing actually happened. So why is that happening? The reason that's happening is because in root.tsx, we actually need to tell React Router where we want to render any of the child routes. In fact, you can nest routes over and over again, and you need to be able to tell your parent route where it wants to render any of its children routes. In this case, it's pretty simple. What we're going to do is we're going to add a little outlet, which is the way that you say, hey, here's the child route and here's what I want to render. We're just going to render it down here inside of a detail. Of course, we do need to import outlet for this to work. And now we can see that it says contact. Let's make that a little bit more interesting. So I'm just copying and pasting a bunch of content, and now we can see that we have a basic template for a contact. Now, if we click on the different links in the sidebar, you may notice that the favicon actually blinks really quickly. And that is because we're actually doing a full document request every single time we hit one of these links. Since we have React and React Router and everything at our fingertips, we can actually do client-side routing, which means that we will be updating the URL and the UI in the client. It'll be a little bit faster and more responsive for our user. So let's go ahead and do that. So inside of root, we can change these A tags to links. These links come from React Router, and we'll just go ahead and change them all. We change the href to the 2. And now when we switch between these two, you see that the URL updates, but nothing else really updates. And that's just because there's not really any data to change. But this isn't doing a full document request, and that's exactly what we wanted. All right, let's get rid of this inline data and start rendering some data from a little database that we have set up in this project. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to import from the module ./data. We're going to get contacts. Let's export a function called client loader, and we're going to make it async. So client loader is a special named export that you can add to any route module, and React Router will know, hey, this is a loader I need to run on, you guessed it, the client. So this will run before it tries to render any React. And inside of here, we're going to await get contacts and save those to a variable, and then just return them. Now we can pull out loader data from the app props, and we can pull off contacts from that loader data. All right, inside of our nav, we're going to remove this old list, and we're just going to paste in a mapping of all the contacts so that we can see them on the left-hand side. All right, we've got all of our data on the left-hand side loaded in and rendering. Now, it'd be nice if we could actually get the types of this data. So how might we do that? Well, you'll see at the top, we're actually importing this type called route from /+types/route. So let's see what we have on that. We have actually a bunch of things, action args, client action args, all this sort of stuff. We want the component props. And then inside of component props, we can actually see that it has the loader data and it has an object of contacts with the type of contact record as an array. If we passed in something else here, the loader data would automatically know the type, which is super cool. So how is this happening? This is actually happening because React Router is auto-generating all of the types for every single route automatically as we're running our dev server, which is super cool. So you can see all these different types in here. We've got some niceties set up with our tsconfig file to where we're using something called root directories. There's all sorts of stuff you can read on our documentation if you want to learn more about that. In fact, there's this whole explanation that explains how the type safety works. So feel free to check this out on your own time. Great, now that I've got my types working and all the data is loading, let's talk a little bit about our rendering strategy. So if I refresh the page, you'll see very quickly that there's a flash of white. Why is this happening? It's happening because this is a completely client-side rendered app. In fact, if I disable JavaScript and refresh, you'll see that nothing loads at all. This is purely client-side rendered. There's no server-side rendering going on. You have full control. If we go into reactrouter.config.ts, so this is another special file for React Router as a framework, and you can see that we have SSR set to false. If we flip that to true, you got it. Server-side rendering is going to take over and we will be server-side rendering. For now, we're just going to client-side render, perfectly valid strategy. Really depends on your use case, what you're comfortable with, and what your users need. So let's have a better experience than this flash of white when people first load the page. Back inside of root.tsx, we're going to export something else, another named function called HydrateFallback. So this component, we can return whatever we want. Here, we'll just return loading, and pretty boring, but this will be the fallback that people will see. When we build the project, when SSR is false, this will actually be rendered as part of the index.html file. So here I'm going to add this simple little loading spinner. So if we refresh, we can see loading, please wait with that loading spinner. That's a much nicer experience. Not perfect, but we're going to do away with it later. For now, this is definitely much, much better than what we had. If we go back to the homepage, we can see that we actually have kind of a pretty ugly and not great experience. We have all of our names on the left, which is great, but we really should add something on the right-hand side here. So let's make a new route module. We'll call it home.tsx, seems appropriate. This time, instead of doing a route with a slash, we can actually use an index little helper and just give it the name of the route. So what index means is it just means that if you're at the slash of whatever route you're on, this is what's going to render there. So for instance, if we had route/contacts and we had some children inside of it, we could do the index of that and call it, whatever we want. We give it some file. But basically, this is saying whenever we're at /contacts/ then it will render whatever this index is. So the index, really, it's just the slash of that section. So the index at the very top means it's the slash of the entire thing. In this case, localhost 5173, or just your application. And so that's what we're going to try and render here. So inside of home.tsx, we're just going to copy and paste another little thing. And if we refresh here, we can see, there you go, React Router. This is a demo for React Router. Check out the docs at reactrouter.com. Perfect. That's a very simple homepage, but it's better than a white screen. All right, so we got some data loading. We got a homepage. Before we go on to add all the contact pages and dynamically load that data and allow us to edit it and all that kind of stuff, let's add one more kind of static page, and this will be our about page. So we'll create a route called about.tsx. Let's make sure we hook it up inside of routes. We'll add route about, and then routes/about.tsx. Again, we could call this whatever we want. We're doing the hookup here. All right, more copy and paste. It's just JSX, not really that interesting. Now let's add in root.tsx a link so we can actually go to the about page. So inside of this h1, we'll do a link to about. Now at the bottom, we can see React Router context / about. Perfect. Now this is a little tight, which we could certainly adjust the stylings, but there's actually a bigger issue here. On the about page, I don't really want to load any data. It's just an about page. I just want you to be able to see it. And I really actually would like to pre-render it. I'm not going to change this content much. And since it's all JSX in this case, when I change it, I'm always going to be redeploying. So I might as well just rebuild it anyway. So let's go ahead and move this to where it's not rendering with the layout. We're not loading all the layout data. And then let's pre-render the about page. So the first step is we're actually going to create a layouts route module. So this is another route module. We're going to differentiate it and put it inside of a layouts folder. So layouts / sidebar. Again, you can put this wherever. We could co-locate it with routes. Doesn't really matter. We're just going to put it in here to make it differentiated for my sake. For now, I'm just going to render an outlet, nothing really special here. And then let's actually hook it up inside routes.tsx. So now we can pull out layout, which is another little helper. And we define the actual route module itself, and then we can pass along all of these routes as children to it. So now we're saying that the home and the contact ID are nested underneath this layout of layouts, and the about is outside of the layout. So it's not going to actually render with this sidebar. The next thing we need to do is we need to go back to root.tsx, and we actually need to copy everything that we have inside of app. So we'll take all of that, and we're actually going to put that inside of that layout sidebar. And of course, we're missing a bunch of things. So let's get rid of this return and pull out the loader data from the route. And we'll find the correct one, which is the sidebar dot component props. And let's also grab from the root the client loader, because we do need that. All right, everything is looking pretty good. We do need to pull in link, and we need to pull in form, and of course get contacts. Okay, that one's good. Let's fix up root. So root should just be returning an outlet at this point. We don't really want to return anything else inside of the root. And let's get rid of everything else we're not using. All right, let's give this a refresh just to make sure everything worked out well. Looks like it can't find app/data inside of our layout, so I probably just imported something incorrectly. That's right. There we go. Perfect. So now this is not rendering with that sidebar. It's also not going to load the contacts on the about page because the about page is outside of the layout, which is responsible for loading all those contacts. And so if we go back to the demo, we still have our sidebar, which is great. And then if we go to a user, we actually go to the page, we're still seeing our cat and your name and all the default stuff, but we're going to be fixing that in just a bit. So now, like I said, on the about page, I actually want to pre-render this. I don't need there to be a little loading symbol. I can just pre-render this. This is all static content that I can just render at build time. So the way we do that is we go back to reactrouter.config, and we can pass a pre-render field, and we could pass true, and that will just find everything that's static and pre-render that. But I like a little bit more control, and so we're just going to say /about, and that means that at build time, it's going to look at the /about route. It's going to figure out what that is based on our routes.ts file. It's going to find that route module, and it's going to render it all and make an index.html file for it. So now if I refresh, I don't get any sort of loader, which is great because it's just pre-rendered it and it's all ready to go, which is awesome. Now going back to our demo, we're going to start adding all the really data-rich features. And I'm going to go ahead and flip server-side rendering to true here. Again, both strategies are totally valid. You could use server-side rendering or client-side rendering for this. In fact, when you are server-side rendering, you're still doing client transitions. You're still rendering on the client. You just have access to run loaders on the server, and you just have a lot more access to different features running a server. Of course, you have to deal with the infrastructure of deploying and running your application on a server. For this demo, it's fine, and we just want to show the full features that you get with React Router. In fact, you'll notice that the app is still working completely correctly, and that's because inside the sidebar route module, we're using a client loader. So you can actually use client loaders even when you're doing server-side rendering. We'll go ahead and change this to a loader though, and we will not get a little spinner anymore because this is now rendering it on the server. If we disable JavaScript and refresh, we still see all of our data because it is actually rendering an HTML file and sending that down whenever we request a new route. So inside of our contact.tsx file, we've got some fake data. Let's actually pull this data out of our database. So we're going to add a async function, another loader. And sure, we could just return what we have. That's fine. And here we're going to pull out the loader data. We'll get the route.component props, and let's pull out the correct route from this one, plus type / contact. It's just the name of whatever the route module is that we have. That's how the types are auto-generated. And here we can pull this out of loader data. We'll destructure it. Nothing new here. We're still returning the fake data. So let's actually get some real data from our database. So here we're going to do contact equals await.get contact. And this contact we need to pull from data. And we'll just return the contact, whatever it is. And here it automatically figured out what we wanted. We actually want to pull out the params from route dot, not component props, but rather loader args. And we'll see that the params are actually already typed correctly, which is really cool. Contact ID with a string, and that actually comes from our routes.ts file. So it figured out, oh, okay, you're going to pass in a param, and we're going to call it contact ID. So it automatically gives us the type of params that we want, which is great. So we don't even have to check for that. We are still getting some type errors down here, and that's because contact could be a contact record or it could be null. And this is important. Even though we know that the type of contact ID is always going to be a string, we have no idea what it is. It could be complete gibberish, in which case nothing really exists and we get a pretty ugly error. So we actually want to account for this case, and we want to make sure that the contact itself exists. And if it doesn't exist, we will throw a 404. So if no contact, throw a new response and say not found with a status of 404. If we refresh, it'll say 404, the requested page could not be found. We can adjust what this error looks like, but that's outside of the scope of what we want to do right now. All right, now we've got all of our data loading correctly using the param, which is great. Let's create a new contact. Uh-oh, everything blew up. And if we open up our console, we can see that it says root does not have an action, but you're trying to submit to it. To fix this, please add an action function to the root. The reason is because when we hit new, we are actually using a form. So let's go find that. Inside the layouts, we had this form, not the search one. We'll get to that later. But this form with a button of type submit new, and it just posts to wherever it's at, which in this case is /, which means that it's just finding the highest route module that's not a layout, which in this case is a root. So we need to add an action to the root. Otherwise, it's just going to say method not allowed, and it's basically going to fail whenever we try to submit a form against a route module that has no actions. So we'll open up root, and then we're going to export an async function, not a loader though. This time we'll export an action. And inside of this, we want to create a contact, and we'll await, create empty contact, and we'll return it in case we ever need it and get that from the data. All right, let's try that one more time. We hit new, we have a new contact. They don't have a name or an avatar or anything, so we'll fix that up next. Before we get to that, let's just talk about this for a second. So what just happened? Well, we have this capital F form, which is like an enhanced version of the lowercase f form that you can use in regular HTML. And so when we hit the button, it triggered a submit, and then React Router handled the navigation of the form. So a form with a method post is still a navigation of sorts. It's posting to that URL, and the action is the thing that it's going to post to. So if JavaScript were disabled, this would still work. It would still post the action. You just want to get the client-side navigation. And the other cool thing is, as soon as the action ran inside the root, it went ahead and automatically re-triggered all loaders that are on the page right now. And so the only loader we have right now in this case was the sidebar. And so it knew that, hey, there's actually a new entry. It doesn't have a name or anything, so we'll render this kind of default experience. But we didn't have to automatically handle some sort of client state or use query or any sort of thing like that. React Router just had all of that data in the loader data itself, and all loaders reran whenever we submit an action, which is really, really cool. This is actually the way that HTML has worked for a really, really long time. So React Router is really just enhancing that and giving us a nice single page app client-side navigation experience. Okay, let's add the ability to edit this contact. So first we're going to make a new route, and we're going to call it edit contact.tsx. Once again, we can name this whatever we want. We'll add this here, and this time it'll be /edit. And then of course, this will be edit-contact. We still want this in the sidebar, but we don't want it to be nested inside of the actual contact page itself. So when we're on contact/whoever/edit, we don't want this URL to be nested. We actually just want to replace this. So that's why we have it as a sibling to the contact page. Well, let's copy and paste a bunch more JSX and another loader and all this stuff. And we'll go to our new contact and we'll edit it. Perfect. Now we have a new form with the first, last name, Twitter handle, all that good stuff. And you can see that's all down here inside of this form. We got various inputs and labels and all the stuff that we need for us to be able to edit a new contact or an existing contact. So before we actually fill out this information and save this new contact, we need to add another action. We need to add an action to the edit contact so we can actually post the data and update our database. So we'll export an async function of an action, pulling out the request and the param, which we're going to need these two. First, we're going to get the form data, which we can get off the request. So when you submit a form, all of the inputs and everything automatically get serialized. And this is a really nice method for just pulling off that data, and you'll get a type of form data. With this, we could do FormData.get, and we could pull out like first, and that would give us the first name, and do some validation and everything. We're just going to do something really simple in this case, and we're going to use object.fromEntries. And then we'll update it. And finally, we're going to return a redirect to contact / the param of the contact ID. This redirect is just a nice util that will return a 302 response. Let's see if this actually worked. I'm going to save this and fill this out real quick. And hit save. There we go. There's Brooks Librarian. We've actually got two of them on the left-hand side. Oops. Oh well. Now that we just learned about the redirect, we can actually fix something that was kind of goofy earlier. When I hit new, it automatically creates this new user, but it should redirect us to the page where we can actually create that new user. Just adding them to the left-hand side is not a good experience. I might not even notice that if I'm not really paying that much attention. And even if I do, it's first I'm going to click it here, and it takes me to this really ugly page, and then I have to click edit. At this point, I don't even know if I want to use your address book app. So back inside of root, instead of returning the contact, let's just redirect to contact / that new contact's ID / edit. Now, if we hit Alex and hit new, great, we're taken to the page of the new contact, which is perfect. I've cleaned up the data again, and I want to focus a little bit more on the styles. So right now, if we go to a contact page, we don't have a good way to know in the left-hand side which contact we're actually on. React Router, though, gives us a nice component called navlink that will allow us to know information about the page that we're on so we can do different styling things with it. So back inside of sidebar, where we have these links, we're going to change this to nav link, and we need to change the closing one. So far, nothing is really that different, except that it seems to know already a little bit and knows which page we're on. That's because React Router automatically adds an active class to whatever anchor is active in this case. And we have some styling already set up to take advantage of that. We also have a little bit more information. So if we add a class name and we return a function, we can see inside of here, we have is active, is pending, and is transitioning. So we have states of what's going on as we're navigating around, and we can do different things stylistically with that. We'll say that once it's active, we're going to add the class of active, and if it's pending, we'll add the class of pending. Otherwise, we're not going to add any special classes. Now, if we click around, we can see that the pending state is different than the active state. The active state is only applied to whoever we're actually on. Nice little UX improvement. While we're at it, let's add a global pending UI. When we're moving between different pages, we don't see anything on here to really indicate that we're going to a new page until the new page exists, and then it all pops in at once. So we're going to use a hook called navigation. This comes from React Router. And this navigation object has a property called state, which will have a few different values that it could be. It could be idle, it could be loading, which is when we're going to a new page and there's a new GET request happening, or it could be submitting, which is when we're submitting a post request or something with a form that's not a GET request. So down here, we're going to add a class name, and we'll say that if navigation.state is loading, we'll add loading, and otherwise we'll add nothing. So now if we jump around, we can see that there's a brief little overlay that happens between these different pages that shows that something is happening while underneath the hood, data is being fetched, and we're going to this new page, and it will render once the data is ready. Back to being able to manipulate our data, well, let's add the ability to remove somebody. So inside of our contact, we do have a couple of different forms. So we have the form, that's the edit. We've already seen that. That actually uses a method of GET. That's the automatic method, which is really just a navigation to a different page, which is cool. So we didn't actually have to make this into a link. We could just make it a form. So that's something neat. But in this form, we actually have a method of post, and it has an action of destroy. So this destroy is going to go to contact / whatever we're on, like Kent%20c.-dods/destroy. That is the route it's going to try to post to automatically. So we need to make that route and to return a action from it. So we're going to call it destroy-contact.tsx. inside of our routes. We'll set it up. And really, this one doesn't even need to be in the layout, but it's just an action. So we're not actually going to render any UI. And so this is what we call a resource route. So it doesn't totally matter that's running inside of the layout. The layout is really just for the UI aspect. If that didn't make any sense, I recommend reading this resource routes doc on the React Router documentation. It'll explain exactly what I'm talking about. All right, let's destroy. So we're going to import our redirect from React Router, and we'll import our types as usual. And then we're going to need a delete contact from the data module that we have. And then finally, we're going to export an async function called action. We'll take out the params because we do need to know what param there is. And then we're going to delete the contact of the param with the contact ID. And then once we're done, we'll just redirect back to the homepage. With that, we'll see if we can delete Kent. Goodbye, Kent. I miss him already. All right, let's edit Ryan here. You know what? I changed my mind. I don't want to edit him. Ah, man, our cancel button doesn't even do anything. Let's hook that up next. So back inside of our edit route, we're going to find where we have the cancel. So in this case, it's a button of type button, which might seem a little bit silly, but this is the way for us to avoid a button actually triggering a submit when it's inside of a form. So we'll go ahead and add an on click event handler. And when this is clicked, we want to navigate back one. We want to go to the previous page that we were on. So we can do this if we pull out another hook. So we're going to do const navigate, and we're going to use navigate from React Router. So this allows us to programmatically choose our navigations, whereas things like links, link components, nav link components, that's more of a declarative method. I'm going to tell React Router that a navigation needs to happen. And so here we will navigate, and we'll go -1, which just means go back, -1. All right, I'm going to get out of this, and we'll go back to Ryan Florence's page. Okay, we're almost done. Let's hook up this search bar. So I'm going to search for Ryan and hit enter. And we see that the URL changed. We have $Q equals Ryan. So that's cool, but we didn't really search. So this isn't hooked up. But before we even hook it up, let's just talk about this first piece. What just happened here? Well, we added a query param of Q equals Ryan. Why did that happen? Because inside of the sidebar, the very top, with this form of search form, we have a name of Q. So this automatically got serialized. This form, because it doesn't have a method of post, its method is automatically get. So it's navigation when we hit enter on this, which is pretty cool. So that means that it serialized the queue with whatever we had inside of the input. So yeah, that's pretty nice. We didn't have to create a control component or anything. We just got the behavior for free. So let's go ahead and use that query param to filter the data. Inside our loader up here, we're going to pull out of here the request, and we'll get the URL. So we'll do const q equals URL. We'll get the search params, and we'll get q. And then our get contacts is already set up to where we can just pass in the query into it. Great. Let's see if this works now. All right. Automatically, I can see that it filtered down to Ryan. And if I go to RY, we got Paul. Looks like there's probably an RY in there. Maybe it's just doing a fuzzy search. That makes sense. Yep, there's an R, there's a Y. Okay, so this isn't bad, but we can already see, even though I've got Q equals RY, I don't have it inside of my input, which is kind of silly. So let's go ahead and return whatever the query is. We'll pull it out of our loader data, which we automatically have the type now. So that's awesome. And then inside of search contacts, we can pass a default value of Q. And if Q doesn't exist, we'll just make it an empty string. Now, if we refresh, great. We can see that the input automatically has whatever's in here. So if I change this again and automatically go to that, this is auto filled, which is perfect. All right, let's update it again. And then if I hit the back button, man, this is still out of sync. So this says RYA, but it didn't update this. This is where a use effect actually is useful for synchronizing these two different states. So we'll get the search field, and we're just going to do get element by ID. You could use a ref here if you wanted. And then we'll do a quick check of if the search field is an HTML input element, and we'll just change the value to Q. So this will just keep the DOM in sync with React. You could also make this a control component if you really want to. We'll save that and make sure this works. So we'll hit Ryan, and then we'll go back, and we'll see RYA, we'll see RY, we'll see Ryan, and then we'll do ER, go back, go forward. Great, everything is synchronized correctly. Okay, let's make this a little bit better. Right now, I have to hit enter every time I want to do a new search. Let's just make it automatically submit every time I'm typing a new letter. You don't have to do this. This is definitely a UX decision, but in this case, I'd like to do it. Our API is pretty quick, and it's not very costly because it's fake data. So here, I'm going to pull out another hook called useSubmit from React Router. This is an imperative way to submit a form. So you could just use the capital F form, and then when you hit enter, which is what we're doing, The browser serializes everything, but here's a way for us to tell React Router, hey, I want to submit the form myself based on some other action that's not like a standard HTML form submission. So inside of our form here, we're going to add an onChange. So every time there's a change, we're going to get the event and we'll submit the event.currentTarget. So here we can actually just pass in the form itself. The current target will point to this form. Every time it's changing, we're just saying, hey, submit this form, submit this form, submit this form. And it automatically serializes for us, which is really cool. Let's make sure that's working. So if I go back, forward, great. Every single time it is re-rendering everything and fetching new data and all that good stuff. All right, let's add a pending navigation as we're moving between these. We would like a little spinner to show up instead of this magnifying glass just to add a little bit of niceness and tell the user what's happening. So we'll add a field called const searching. We'll take that navigation that we have, and from it, we can pull off a location and say, if there's a location, we're going to get the search params. We'll create a new URLSearchParams of the navigation.location.search. Then we'll say, hey, does it have Q? Is Q in there? If Q is in there, that means that we are searching. So this is the pending navigation that's happening. If there's a query, it means there's a pending search that's happening. With that, we're going to go down to our search contacts. We're going to add a class name of loading if we are searching. And here, instead of hidden true, it'll just be not searching. It'll be hidden. And so if we are searching, it will not be hidden. And there we go. As I'm changing, as I'm typing in things, we get a little spinner, which is very cool. Let's actually get rid of the pending indicator on the right hand where it adds that overlay, because that's kind of distracting. And that really should only be there if we're actually switching in between different contexts. That's where we want that to show up. So that one's just down here. We're going to say, and not searching. Now, if we type that, we can see that we get our little spinner, but the right-hand side doesn't get the overlay. If we right-click on the back button, we can see that our history stack is a little bit crazy. So every time I was submitting that form, I was adding a new entry to that stack, which kind of stinks. So if I'm doing BROOK, and I'm like, you know what? I want to go back. Well, it's going to go back one letter at a time, which is not what we want. In this case, we just want to say, okay, have you searched? And if you want to go back, that means you probably just want to be wherever you were. So if I'm on Alex and I hit BROO, and I hit back, I just want to be on Alex immediately. I don't want to go back in the individual characters that I typed. This is pretty easy to do. In our onChange, where we call the submit, first we're going to say, is this the first search? And that will be true if Q is null. And in that case, when we submit, we actually want to replace if this is not the first search. So what replace does is it actually replaces in the history stack of the navigations, it replaces the current one with this new navigation that we're doing. So let me open this up in a new tab. I'm going to type BROO. And if I hit back, I'll just be back at the home page. The last little piece we want to add is we want to add the ability to favorite a contact. So right now, if I try to favorite, we get the whole method not allowed thing because there's no action with that favoring form submission. So inside of the contact route module, down in the favorite component, we can add a fetcher from useFetcher. So it's a really cool little util from React Router that allows us to do form submissions, but without the navigational piece. So like when we edit and when we delete, we are actually triggering a navigation, but here we want it to be in place. We don't want to actually navigate the user away to something. We just want to do it in place. So we're going to change this form with a fetcher.form. And so now this will happen in place. Of course, we need to actually create the action. So nothing really new here. We're just getting the params and the request, and we are going to update the contact with the correct contact ID. And here we're going to get favorite, which that comes from the input with the name of favorite down in our favorite component. And if it's true, then it'll be true. And if it's not true, then it's false. We'll save this. And if I hit the star, there's a bit of a delay, but we can see that cat is now one of my favorite contacts. So we could add a pending indicator. We could add some loading state or whatever while that's going on, or we could just do this optimistically. Most of the time, if someone hits this button, it's going to change states to the opposite of whatever it is. So we can just optimistically determine what it is. And then once it's resolved, it'll fall back to whatever the data says that it is because it's going to rerun the loader. So down in our action, we can actually pull off of the fetcher the form data, and we'll assign this to a variable called favorite. And we'll say if that form data exists, we're going to get from it the favorite field, and we're going to check if it's true or not. Otherwise, we'll fall back to our contact.favorite. which is what we had up here. So now we can delete line 82. So now if I click, we see instantly what it is. On the left-hand side, it doesn't update until the data is actually resolved. The loaders have actually rerun, which is probably good. So that's it. We covered a ton of ground. We went over a bunch of features, and yet we really just scratched the surface of everything you can do with React Router. However, these are the fundamental building blocks. You got loaders, actions, your routes, server-side rendering, client-side rendering, pre-rendering, auto-generated types, throwing redirects and responses, all that good stuff. You can build whatever you want. I highly recommend reading all of the docs and looking at our APIs. Join us on Discord if you have any questions or just want to talk to other people building cool stuff with React Router. And of course, have fun.